The following story is a translated and adapted conversation, recounting supernatural experiences from around the world. This content is intended for entertainment purposes only. Listen with an open mind and enjoy the thrill of the unknown. The content in this video is purely for entertainment. Viewer discretion is advised. If you are easily frightened, be prepared some stories might just send chills down your spine. If you're ready, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and immerse yourself in the world of the unexplained.
In a quiet corner of southern Thailand, where the Andaman Sea whispers against jagged shores and rubber plantations stretch into the haze, lies Thungsong Witaya School, a modest high school in Nakhon Si, Thammarat province. Built decades ago, its concrete buildings have weathered monsoons and time, their paint peeling under the tropical sun. Tucked behind the main campus is a small annex, a single-story structure of faded yellow walls and a corrugated roof, once a rehearsal room for the school Esna Taki troupe. It's been locked and forgotten since the late 1990s, when Kru Noi, the beloved dance instructor, dropped dead mid-lesson from a sudden heart attack. The students called it Hong Ram Rautha, abandoned dance room, and avoided it, their whispers painting it with dread. Kru Noi had been strict but kind, her voice guiding girls through the intricate steps of Ram Thai and Lakhon. Her death left the troupe shattered, and the room was sealed, its instruments and costumes left to rot. But the stories lingered. Footsteps tapping in the dark, shadows dancing in a space with no mirrors, and a presence that resented intruders. What happened there wasn't just a tragedy, was the birth of something restless, something that refused to fade. It was a humid night in the rainy season when Nong, a 15-year-old student with a mop of black hair and a defiant streak, hatched the plan. She was a troublemaker, quick with a laugh, quicker with a challenge, and the school's ghost stories were her favorite target. Her best friend, Pri, a shy girl with glasses and a nervous habit of twisting her braid, was her usual accomplice, dragged along by Non's relentless energy. Their third companion, Toi, a lanky boy who fancied himself brave, rounded out the trio. They'd been swapping tales in the dorm after lights out, the air thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth drifting through the open windows. The dance room's not haunted, Nun declared, her voice cutting through the whispers of their classmates. It's just old and creepy. I bet I can spend an hour in there and come out fine. Pri frowned, clutching her pillow. Don't nang, they say. Kru Noi's still there waiting. Toi smirked, leaning back on his bunk. Prove it, then. I'll go too, Pri, you in. Pri shook her head, but Non's grin sealed her fate. She's in, midnight. Meet at the back gate. Nong felt a thrill, her bravado masking a flicker of unease. She'd heard the stories Kru Noi collapsing as her girls screamed, her body cold before the ambulance arrived, but she didn't believe in ghosts. Pri's fear was real, her hands trembling as they snuck out, the dorm snores covering their escape. Toi's swagger hid a nervous twitch, his flashlight beam jittering across the wet grass. The school loomed in the dark, its edges blurred by mist, and the annex waited, a squat shadow against the night. The trio reached the dance room, its padlocked door rusted but intact. Rain pattered on the roof, a steady drum that muffled their steps. Toi jimmied the lock with a wire from his pocket, learned it from YouTube. He bragged, and the chain clattered free. Nang pushed the door open, a wave of stale air rushing out dust, mold, and something sweeter like wilted flowers. Pri hesitated, her voice a whisper. We shouldn't, but Nong grabbed her wrist, pulling her inside. Don't be a baby. The room was a tomb of decay. Their flashlights swept across cracked tiles, a sagging stage, and shelves of mildewed costume silk skirts and headdresses dulled by time. A taffin drum sat in the corner, its skin torn, and a kong-wang gong leaned against the wall, its brass tarnished. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and Non's bravado wavered, a chill prickling her spine. "See, nothing," she said, forcing a laugh, but it echoed wrong, swallowed by the silence. Toei kicked a pile of fabric, dust clouding the air. "Lame, let's set a timer," and he stopped, head tilting. "You hear that?" Nong frowned, straining her ears. Then it came, a faint tap, tap-tap, like bare feet moving in rhythm. Pri whimpered, clutching Non's arm. "It's her," she breathed. The sound grew, a steady beat matching an unseen tune, and Non's heart thudded, her bravado cracking. "Just echoes," she muttered, but her voice shook. The tapping circled them, now joined by a low hummer melody, faint but familiar, like the Flang Chetri crew Noi had taught. Toei swung his flashlight, its beam jittering across the walls, and froze. "There," he whispered, pointing to the far end. A shadow swayed, tall and slender, its arms arcing in a dancer's pose. Non's breath hitched, her defiance melting into dread. "That's not possible," she said, stepping closer. The wall was bare, no mirrors, no glass yet. The shadow danced, clear as day. Pri sobbed, backing toward the door. "We need to go." But Nan grabbed her, stubbornness flaring. "It's a trick, someone's messing with us." She aimed her flashlight at the shadow, and it vanished, only to reappear behind them closer now, its edges sharper. Toei cursed, his bravado gone. "Nan, this isn't funny." The tapping intensified, a staccato rhythm that shook the floor, and the air turned frigid, their breath fogging in the beams. Then they saw her not in the shadow, but in the space where a mirror should have been. A figure in a dancer's garb, charter headdress glinting, Fa Sin skirt swaying, rising from the tiles like mist. She danced, her movements hypnotic, her face hidden. Nong's knees buckled, awe and terror colliding. "Kru Noi," she whispered, the name slipping out. The dancer paused, mid-step, and turned. Her face was a nightmare pale and waxen, eyes sunken and black, lips parted in a silent gasp. Her chest bore a dark stain, as if her heart had burst, and her gaze locked onto them, unblinking, endless. Pri screamed, collapsing, and Toei dropped his flashlight, the beam spinning wildly. Nang stood rooted, her mind blank, her body trembling as the dancer glided forward, her feet tapping in time with an unseen beat. The music erupted. Full pie fat ensemble, gongs clashing, pipes wailing, filling the room with chaos. The walls pulsed, dust raining from the ceiling, and shadows multiplied, dozens of dancers, faceless and fleeting, mirroring her steps. "You came back," her voice rasped, not aloud but inside them, a cold thread weaving through their skulls. Nun's stomach churned, the sweet scent turning sour-rot blood. Decaying, she felt her weight, a pull, dragging at her soul. Visions hit them, crew, Noi shouting corrections, her girls laughing, then her clutching her chest, collapsing as they screamed. Her death had trapped her, her love for the dance twisting into a curse, and now she sought them students to join her endless rehearsal. "No," Nong shouted, shoving Pri toward the door, but the dancer lunged, her cold hand brushing Non's arm, searing it with ice. Pain jolted Nang awake, her defiance surging. "Run," she yelled, dragging Pri as Toei stumbled behind. The music chased them, a frenzied wail, and the dancer's shadow stretched clawing at the walls, the floor, the air. They reached the door, Non's shoulder slamming it open, and burst into the rain, the night a shock of warm, wet relief. The tapping faded, her presence receding, but they didn't stop racing across the campus, mud splashing their legs, until they collapsed in the dorm, soaked and shaking. Pri sobbed, curling into a ball, while Toei stared blankly, his bravado shattered. Nong clutched her arm, a burn mark forming red lines like footprints, her breath ragged. "We saw her," she whispered, terror giving way to guilt. They'd mocked her, intruded on her grave, and she'd answered. The trio never spoke of it, their pact sealed by fear, but the marks lingered, burns that faded but ached in the rain. The dance room stayed locked, the school ignoring their pleas to investigate, and the stories grew, footsteps heard, shadows seen. Nan changed after that, her defiance dulled, her nights plagued by tapping and crew noise black eyes. One stormy evening, passing the annex, she heard it again, the pie fat, faint and mournful, calling her back. She ran, but she knew they'd danced with her, and the rhythm would never let go. In a university nestled among the misty hills of northern Thailand, likely Chiang Mai University. Though no one says it aloud, there's a building few students linger near after dark. Tucked behind the Faculty of Fine Arts, a squat concrete structure with peeling paint houses the drama department's relics. One room within, known as Hong Kep Chut, Nang Ramba, costume storage room, has been locked for years. Its door sealed with a rusted padlock and faded warning tape. Inside, shelves sag under the weight of old Nartaki costumes. Silk fascine skirts, golden chador headdresses, and bangles dulled by dust. It's a tomb of forgotten art, abandoned after a tragedy no one speaks of plainly. The story traces back to the 1990s, when Nang Ori, a talented dancer and student, ruled the university's Lakon troupe. Ari was a vision, her movements fluid, her presence commanding, but her life ended abruptly. During a late-night rehearsal, she collapsed in the storage room, clutching a costume, her heart failing under mysterious strain. Some whispered of overwork, others hinted at darker forces, a curse tied to the costumes she adored. After her death, strange things plagued the room. Whispers in the dark, shadows moving without source, and a chill that defied the tropical heat. The university sealed it, but the whispers persist, and those who enter rarely leave unscathed. It was a foggy night in the cool season when Fateh, 20-year-old sophomore studying Thai classical dance, faced a dilemma. Fa was a slight girl with sharp eyes and a quiet determination, her long hair always tied back during practice. She wasn't the best in her troupe, her steps lacked the effortless grace of others, but she worked hard, driven by a love for the art her grandmother had taught her. Tonight, the troupe was preparing for a cultural festival, and Fa had forgotten her costume during the day's rehearsal. "I'll grab it quick," she'd told her friend Mew, a bubbly junior who'd offered to come along. "It's just the storeroom, no big deal." Mew had frowned, tugging Fa's sleeve. "Not that room. It's locked for a reason, Fa. They say Eerie's still in there." Fa laughed, brushing it off. "Ghost stories. Come on, I'm not a kid." She'd heard the tales everyone had, but she didn't believe them. Ghosts were for campfire scares, not real life. Still, as she left the dorm, her flashlight in hand, a flicker of unease stirred. The campus was silent, the fog thick and clinging, muffling the usual hum of cicadas. The Fine Arts building loomed ahead, its windows dark, and the annex waited like a crouched shadow. Fa reached the storage room, its door a slab of weathered wood marked with peeling tape. "Do not enter." The padlock hung loose, rusted through, and she smirked. "Some security," she muttered, pushing it aside. The door creaked open, a wave of stale air rushing out dust, mildew, and a faint floral scent like old jasmine. Her flashlight swept the room, revealing chaos. Shelves of costumes, some toppled, their silk skirts spilling onto the floor. A cracked mirror in the corner. A wooden chest smeared with grime. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and Far shivered, her bravado wavering. She stepped inside, the floor gritty under her sneakers, and aimed for a shelf near the back where her troops' costumes were stored. In and out, she whispered, her voice echoing oddly. The silence pressed against her ears, broken only by her own breathing, and she hurried, rifling through the fabric-stread silk gold trim, her hands trembling despite herself. Then it came a soft whisper, faint but clear, Far. She froze, heart lurching. "Who's there?" she called, spinning around, her beams slicing the dark. "Nothing, just costumes, dust, shadows." "Mew, if that's you, it's not funny," she snapped, though she knew Mew was back at the dawn. The whisper came again, Far, closer now, from the room's far corner. Her stomach twisted, fear clawing up her spine, but she forced it down. "Imagination," she muttered, grabbing her costume of blue, fascinand, turning to leave. As Far reached the door, the whisper sharpened, Far, stay, and a shadow moved in her peripheral vision. She whipped around, flashlight trembling, and saw her. A figure in the corner, standing still, clad in an ancient costume chador headdress, glinting faintly, silk skirt draped like a shroud. Her face was obscured, her form unnaturally rigid, and Far's breath hitched, terror flooding her. "Who are you?" she croaked, stepping back. But the figure didn't move, just stood, watching. Then the sound began, footsteps, soft and rhythmic, tap tap tap, like a dancer's pace, circling her. Far's beam darted around, finding nothing, but the steps grew louder, joined by a faint hummer melody, Fleng Chatri, the tune Eerie had loved. The air turned frigid, her breath fogging, and the figure shifted, gliding forward. Far stumbled, her back hitting a shelf, costumes tumbling around her. "Leave me alone," she shouted, voice cracking, but the dancer stopped, head tilting, and raised her face to the light. Her eyes were empty black voids, no whites, no life staring through Far into her. Her skin was pale, waxen, her lips parted in a silent gasp, and her hands clutched the air, trembling. Far screamed, dropping the costume, and the lights flickered the room's old bulbs. Long dead, sparking to life, then dying again. Darkness swallowed them, her flashlight failing, and the dancer's whisper filled the void. "You took my place." Far's knees buckled, her mind reeling as the footsteps resumed, circling faster. The melody swelling her, ghostly pie fat, gongs clashing, pipes wailing. The dancer loomed closer, her empty eyes unblinking, her presence a weight that crushed Far's chest. Visions assaulted her eye, twirling on stage, her laughter, then her collapse in this room. Clutching a costume, her heart bursting under a strain no one understood. Jealousy had cursed her, some said, a rival's hex woven into the silk she wore, binding her here, resenting those who danced after her. "You're not me," Far sobbed, clawing at the door, but it wouldn't budge, the lock jamming shut. The dancer's hand brushed her arm icy, searing and pain jolted through her, her vision blurring. She saw herself in those empty eyes dancing endlessly, her face hollowing, her soul draining into the room. The music surged, the shelves rattling, costumes writhing like living things, and Far felt her body sway, pulled into the rhythm against her will. Terror snapped her awake. "No," she screamed, slamming her shoulder against the door. It gave way, spilling her into the hall, and she ran, the whisper, "Stay," chasing her through the fog. The campus blurred past, her lungs burning, until she collapsed in the dorm. Mew's shocked face, the last thing she saw before darkness took her. F.A. woke days later in the infirmary, feverish and weak. Her arm marked with burn-red lines, like claw marks, unexplainable to the nurse. Mew sat by her, pale and silent, clutching her hand. "What happened?" she whispered, but Far couldn't speak, her throat raw, her mind replaying Eerie's empty eyes. Doctors found no cosmalaria, they guessed, or exhaustion, but Far knew. She'd danced with her, taken her place, and the curse had followed. She quit the troupe, her love for dance soured, and avoided the annex, its shadow a threat in her nightmares. The room stayed sealed, the costumes untouched, but whispers grew, footsteps heard, a figure seen in the dark. Months later, Fa's health faltered, fevers, chills, no Karand, the burn never faded, aching on foggy nights. One evening, walking past the Fine Arts building, she heard it tap-tapped, faint and rhythmic, drifting from the annex. She froze, heart pounding, and saw her in the fog, a dancer, standing still, her empty eyes watching. Far turned away, trembling, but the whisper lingered. Far Eerie had claimed her, and the dance would call her back. In Nekonpatham province, where the golden stupa of Prapatham Chedi pierces the sky, the village of Banwai Phuk holds an annual temple fair at Wat Sai Mai. Every year, as the monsoon rains fade, the grounds come alive with lanterns, food stalls, and the rhythmic clang of Thai music. The highlight is the Ram Thai performance, a troupe of Nartokas, dancing to honor the temple's spirits, their silk skirts swirling under flickering lights. It's a tradition older than anyone can recall, a celebration of faith and community. But there's a shadow over the fair, a tale whispered by the elders, the story of a dancer who returns uninvited. Her name was Nang Thip, a star of the troupe 2 decades ago, her grace unmatched in the village's history. In the early 2000s, during a stormy fair night, she slipped from the stage while dancing, her head striking a stone lantern. She died instantly, her blood staining the earth, and the fair ended in mourning. The troupe buried her with honors, but her spirit, they say, never left. On quiet nights, when the fair winds down and the crowds thin, she reappears, dancing alone, her form fading into the air. The villagers call her Nang Ram Heng Wat, the dancer of the temple land. Her return is both a marvel and a warning. It was a warm evening during the temple fair when Uncle Sam, a 72-year-old musician, sat by the stage, tuning his Ranit Eek. Sam was a fixture at Wat Sai. Maya, wiry man with leathery skin and eyes clouded by years, his hands still nimble on the wooden xylophone. He'd played for the fair since he was a boy, leading the Pai Fat ensemble through decades of performances. The troupe relied on him not just for music, but for the stories he carried, tales of the temple's past that he shared with a gruff fondness. The fair was in full swing. Children darted between stalls, the air thick with the scent of grilled pork and incense, lanterns casting a golden glow over the crowd. The Nartakas were due soon, their chatter drifting from behind the stage as they adjusted headdresses and skirts. Sam's fingers tapped the Renat Ek, coaxing out a soft melody, but a restlessness gnawed at him. The night felt too still, the usual breeze absent, and the temple's stupa loomed darker than usual against the sky. His nephew, Keng, a lanky 19-year-old who played the taffin drum, slumped beside him, wiping sweat from his brow. "Hot tonight, huh, uncle?" he said, grinning. Psalm grunted, his gaze flicking to the stage. Too quiet. Something's off. Kang laughed, nudging him. You and your ghost stories. Thip again. Psalm didn't smile. 20 years since she fell. She's due. Kang rolled his eyes, but Psalm's unease lingered, a cold thread weaving through the humid air. The performance began at dusk, the troupe taking the stage 5 girls in shimmering costumes, their movements sharp and graceful to the Pai Fat's rhythm. Psalm led the ensemble, his mallet striking the Renat Ek, the Ching cymbals clashing, the Pai Nai weaving a high, mournful thread. The crowd clapped, entranced, but Psalm's focus wavered. The air grew colder, his breath faintly visible, and a shadow flickered at the stage's edge, too tall to still. He squinted, his old eyes straining, and saw her, a 6th dancer, stepping from the wings. She wore a chador headdress dulled by time, her fasin skirt swaying as she joined the troupe. Her arms arched in perfect sync, her steps light, and Psalm's heart thudded, recognition dawning. Thip, he whispered, his mallets faltering. Kang noticed, frowning. What's wrong, uncle? Psalm pointed, voice hoarse. Her, she's not ours. The girl danced alone now, the troupe fading back, unaware of her. The crowd murmured, some clapping, others shifting uneasily. She was beautiful, her movements fluid, a vision from Psalm's youth but wrong. Her skin gleamed pale, her hair hung wetly, and her presence pulled the music, bending it to her will. Psalm played on, his hands trembling, the ensemble following her rhythm, slow mournful tune he hadn't called. The dance stretched on, longer than planned, the fair's noise fading to a hush. Psalm's chest tightened, dread pooling as she spun, her skirt flaring. Then she turned, and the world tilted. Her face was a ruin, pale and bruised, one eye swollen shut, blood trickling from her temple where the lantern had struck. Her other eye stared, black and endless, locking onto Psalm, and a faint smile curved her cracked lips. Ken gasped, dropping his drumsticks, and the troupe stumbled, their rhythm breaking. The crowd froze, some whispering prayers, others backing away. Thip, Psalm croaked, the name a plea, a curse. She paused, mid-step, her gaze shifting to the audience, and the music stopped, silence crashing like a wave. Then, before their eyes, she faded, her form dissolving into mist, leaving only the echo of her steps and a chill that lingered on the stage. Psalm sank back, breath ragged, his mallets clattering to the ground. Kang grabbed his arm, pale and shaking. What was that, uncle? The old man couldn't answer, his mind replaying her fall, her scream, the blood, the silence after. She's back, he rasped, guilt clawing him. He'd been there that night, playing as she died, and hadn't stopped her from climbing the slick stage. The fair ended early, the crowd dispersing in whispers, the troupe shaken but silent. Psalm stayed, cleaning the instruments, his hands unsteady. Kang hovered, his bravado gone. She's gone, right? He asked, voice small. Psalm shook his head. Not her. She comes every year, quiet nights like this. He'd seen her before, fleeting glimpses over 2 decades, but never so clear, never so close. The next night, the fair quieter, she returned. The stage was empty, the troupe resting, but Psalm heard a ching-ching, faint and mournful, drifting from the temple grounds. He grabbed a lantern, Kang trailing reluctantly, and followed the sound. She stood by the stone lantern that killed her, dancing alone, her bruised face glowing in the light. Help me, her voice whispered, not aloud but in their minds, a plea that stabbed Psalm's heart. The music swelled, a ghostly ensemble, and shadows joined her faceless dancers, their steps a mirror of hers. Psalm's knees buckled, terror and sorrow colliding. "I couldn't save you," he choked, tears streaming. Her eye fixed on him, her smile twisting, and the lantern flared, casting her shadow across the stupor huge, clawing, alive. Keng pulled Psalm back, his voice trembling. "We need to go," but Psalm resisted, duty binding him. "She's trapped," he said, her death replaying her slip, his failure to act. The music surged, the shadows closing in, and her cold hand brushed his arm, searing it with ice. Pain jolted him, visions of her fall flooding his mind, and he saw himself playing for her, forever, his soul tethered to her dance. "No," Psalm shouted, shoving the lantern at her. The flame flared, her wail piercing the night, and the shadows recoiled. Keng dragged him away, the temple grounds trembling, her plea, "Help me," chasing them into the dark. They stumbled home, the fair's lights fading, her presence a weight on their backs. Psalm never played at the fair again, his hands too shaky, his nights haunted by Ching Ching and Thip's bruised face. Keng left the troop, fleeing to the city, but Psalm stayed, watching the temple from afar. A burn mark lingered on his arm-red lines like her wounds aching on quiet nights. Every year, when the fair falls silent, she dances alone by the lantern, her plea unanswered, her spirit bound to Wat Sai Mai. Psalm knows she waits, and one day he'll join her tune. In Chiang Mai province, where the Mae Ping River winds through lush valleys and ancient teak forests, there's a bridge that locals avoid after dusk, known as Saffin, my Kautha. Old wooden bridges, a rickety span of weathered planks and sagging beams, perched over a narrow stretch of the river just outside a small village called Ban San Pastong. Built decades ago by farmers to connect their fields, it's now a relic, its wood darkened by time and rain. But it's not the creaking boards that keep people away, it's the story of Nang Lamay, the dancer who leaped from its edge. Lamai was a Nartaki in the 1980s, her grace renowned in the village's temple fairs. She danced the ram thai with a lightness that captivated all, her silk skirts swirling like petals in the wind. But her heart belonged to a man who promised her the world, a merchant from the city who swore to marry her. When he abandoned her for another, Lamay's spirit broke. On a moonless night, she climbed the bridge, her dancer's garb dripping with river mist, and threw herself into the churning waters below. Her body was never found, swallowed by the Mae Ping's depths, and since then, her presence lingers. Villagers crossing at night hear her sobs blending with faint Thai music, and some see her dancing in the dark, her wet form fading into the air. It was a humid evening in the rainy season when Phet, a 27-year-old motorcycle mechanic from Ban San Pasong, found himself facing the bridge. Phet was a practical man, broad-shouldered, with oil-stained hands and a quiet demeanor shaped by years fixing bikes in his father's shop. He didn't believe in ghosts. The village tales were just old wives' nonsense to him. But tonight, he had no choice. His grandmother, Ya Yudeng, had called from her riverside hut, her voice trembling over the crackly phone line. "I'm out of medicine," she'd said. "My chest hurts, please, Phet, bring it quick." The pharmacy was a mile away, across the bridge, and the rain had started a soft drizzle that promised to worsen. Phet cursed under his breath, grabbing his helmet and a plastic bag with Yai Deng's pills. "Should have gone earlier," he muttered, straddling his beat-up Honda Wave. The village was quiet as he rode out, its wooden houses shuttered against the night, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and jasmine. The bridge loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the dark sky, the river below a restless murmur. Phet slowed as he neared it, the drizzle turning his visor foggy. He'd crossed Saffron My Cow 1,000 times. Daylight made it a rickety nuisance. Not a haunted legend, but tonight it felt different. The planks glistened, slick and black, and the wind carried a faint sound, a sob, soft and broken, weaving through the rain. He shook his head, irritation masking a flicker of unease. Just the wind, he told himself, revving the engine. Ye needs me ghosts, can wait. The bike rattled onto the bridge, the planks groaning under its weight, and Fett gripped the handlebars tighter. The river churned below, its surface a swirl of shadows, and the drizzle thickened, stinging his face. Halfway across, the sobbing grew clearer now, a woman's cry, laced with a faint ching-ching of cymbals. He slowed, heart thudding, and squinted into the dark. "Who's there?" he called, his voice swallowed by the rain. No answer came, but the sound shifted, sobs blending with the mournful wail of a painai, a melody he'd heard at temple fairs. Fett's stomach twisted, his practicality warring with a creeping dread. "Kids messing around," he muttered, though the village slept behind him. He gunned the engine, the bike lurching forward, and the music faded as he reached the other side, the pharmacy's dim light a beacon through the storm. He grabbed the medicine, his hands unsteady, and rode back, the bridge waiting like a silent trap. This time, the sobbing was louder, the music swelling a full pie-fat ensemble, gongs clashing in the wind. Fett's pulse raced, his breath fogging the visor, and he saw a figure standing mid-bridge, swaying in the rain. She wore a dancer's garb, her cheddar headdress glinting faintly, her silk skirt clinging wetly to her legs. "What the hell?" he whispered, slowing despite himself. Fett stopped, the bike idling, and wiped his visor. She danced slow, graceful, her arms tracing arcs that defied the storm. Her form shimmered, almost translucent, and Fett's awe turned to dread as she turned. Her face was a ruined pale and bloated, eyes hollow and weeping river water. Her lips parted in a silent cry. Her skirt dripped, pooling on the planks, and her gaze locked onto him, piercing through the rain. He froze, terror clawing his throat. "No way," he gasped, the bike wobbling as he backed up. The music surged, a frantic rhythm now, and her sobs broke through. "He left me," not aloud, but in his mind, a wail that shook his skull. The bridge trembled, the planks creaking, and she glided closer, her wet hands reaching, leaving trails of water and mud. Fett revved the engine, panic overriding reason, and sped past her, her fingers brushing his arm, micey, burning, wrong. He didn't stop until he reached Yai Deng's hut, tumbling off the bike, the medicine bag clutched tight. "Fett, what's wrong?" she asked, her frail voice cutting through his gasps. He couldn't answer, his arm throbbing where she'd touched him, the sobbing still echoing in his ears. Yai Deng took the pills, her eyes narrowing at his silence, but Fett brushed it off. "Just the rain," he lied, forcing a smile. He stayed until her breathing eased, the hut's warmth a frail shield against the chill in his bones. But he couldn't stay, his father expected him home. The bridge waited, a gauntlet he had to face again. The rain had worsened, a downpour now, and Fett rode slowly, dread pooling in his gut. As he approached Saffron My Cow, the music returned ching-ching, painai, gongsa dirge that drowned the storm. She stood there again, mid-bridge, her dance frantic, her wet form glowing faintly in the dark. "Not again," Fett groaned, his hands shaking on the grips. He gunned the engine, aiming to barrel through, but the bike sputtered, the headlights flickering, and she appeared before him blocking the path, her hollow eyes blazing. The bridge shook, the river roaring below, and her voice pierced him. "Stay with me." Visions flooded his mind. Lamai laughing with her lover, his cold goodbye, her leap into the dark water. Her sorrow, her rage, pinned her here, and now she sought him a companion in her endless grief. Fet's chest tightened, his body swaying to her rhythm, his will slipping. "I'm sorry," he shouted, tears mixing with rain, but she reached again, her wet fingers clawing at his jacket. Terror snapped him awake. "No," Fet roared, wrenching the bike free, the tires skidding on the slick planks. Her wail chased him. "Stay," the music a cacophony that rattled his skull, but he pushed through, her touch grazing his back as he broke past. The bike lurched onto solid ground, the bridge receding, and the sounds faded, leaving only the rain's roar. He collapsed at home, soaked and trembling, his father's gruff, "Where've you been?" unanswered. Fet scrubbed his arm, the burn mark fading but aching, and sank into bed, the sobbing a faint echo in his dreams. Fet avoided the bridge after that, taking the long road even in daylight, but the mark lingered a faint scar, wet to the touch on rainy days. Sleep brought nightmares of dancing in water, of Lamai's hollow eyes, her wet hands pulling him down. One stormy night, working late in the shop, he heard it ching-ching, faint and mournful, drifting from the river. He looked out, and there she was, on the distant bridge, swaying, watching. Fet turned away, heart pounding, but he knew. She'd seen him, claimed him, and the Mei Ping would always sing her song.